Hello, everybody. We're just waiting for folks to join in, but I'll just kick us off shortly. Just a couple of seconds here. Hello. All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Imainu Okun, and I am the manager of data management and digital learning at CanWatch. I want to thank everyone for joining us for the 2023 CanWatch Academy. And if you're just joining us today, welcome to day 3 of the Academy. So, the Academy is designed to provide a convenient, accessible learning platform for our members, colleagues, and peers. And sessions we offer really respond to the professional development and learning needs and interests that you've shared with us. And so we're very pleased to provide this opportunity to support our members in this way. And we look forward to an exciting afternoon of learning with you. Today's session is being delivered with the support and partnership of Global Affairs Canada. But before I go any further, I'll just do a bit of a land acknowledgement. I am joining you today from Toronto, Ontario, on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. While we meet today on the virtual platform, I'd like to share my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples from all nations across Turtle Island. They are the traditional guardians of the land upon which we live and work, and I acknowledge their longstanding relationship with this territory. So now, before diving into the session, just a few housekeeping notes that I'd like to share. Today's session will be delivered with simultaneous translation available in English and French. So please click on the globe icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen to select your language of preference. The session is being recorded and will be shared in the coming week on our website and as a follow-up email as well. Today's discussion will include a question and answer session. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please include them in the chat box and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. Also, if you're having any technical difficulty during the discussion, please write a message to my colleague, Nicole Jamrozinski, who will be a technical support today. Please put it in the chat box and she'll respond. And with that, I'd like to offer a very warm welcome and thanks to our speakers today, Elizabeth Dyke, who will be leading the session on today's topic around ethics in meal. She's a very close colleague and partner of CanWatch, and we're very excited to have her join us. She also wrote a note on today's topic, ethics in meal, which I'm sure she'll go into a bit more. Ethics in meal for health and rights programming, just a guidance note in the area around monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning in global health and rights. And she's joined today by Dr. Mike Lang, Dr. Benush Ranjani, and Sophie Bodon, and Dr. Oresto Munishi. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And just very happy to be here today to talk about this important subject. I want to also start by saying that I'm on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, currently known as Gatineau. And I make this acknowledgement as a sign of respect for all Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island, past and present, who I recognize as the contemporary stewards of this land and crucial contributors to Turtle Island, and as a show of gratitude for my presence on this land. Je suis très heureuse d'être ici. Je vais présenter en anglais, mais vous pouvez accéder à la traduction simultanée en français. Aussi, une de notre panélistes va parler en français aussi. Vous pouvez aussi poser des questions dans le chat en français ou en anglais. In terms of our agenda, I'm going to just be doing a 15-minute presentation on the guide, and we'll have a 30-minute discussion with our panelists, and then about 15 minutes for questions. So as was mentioned, you can put your questions in the chat. And I'll do a brief bio for each of the panelists when we start our discussion. But they are Dr. Mike Lang, digital storytelling specialist, Dr. Benush Ranjani, who is a health monitoring and evaluation specialist at HealthBridge, Sophie Bourdon, directrice de l'innovation et de l'expertise à Santé Monde, and Dr. Oresto Michael Munishi in Tanzania. So the guidance note that I'm going to be presenting on was released in March of 2023 by CanWatch and was a joint effort with the CanWatch Secretariat, the Metrics Working Group, and Global Affairs Canada. But But first, I want to just set a bit of a context for why ethics matters. So this is a photo of Henrietta Lacks. She was a young African-American mother with 5 children. And in 1951, she visited the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And she had cervical cancer. And her cervical cancer cells were used as a source for the HeLa cell line. And this resulted in major advancements in medical research. But they were taken without her consent. And the HeLa cell line has made a lot of people a lot of money. But she died of cervical cancer and never received any money, nor did anyone in her family. In another example, between 1932 and 1972, the US Public Health Services funded the Tuskegee syphilis experiments on African-American men who were already infected with syphilis. They received free healthcare, but they did not receive treatment for their syphilis. So these are examples in research, but there are many examples in monitoring, evaluation in meal where ethics has not been adequately considered. And so this ethics guidance, the purpose is really to fill a gap in monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning in global health and rights. Ethics is a key concern for a number of reasons, including requirements for some given their link with universities, whether you're doing publications, donor requirements, but it's also a moral imperative for us to address. So there is a lot of ethics information around academics, but not necessarily, and research, but not necessarily a lot around monitoring and evaluation. So that's what this guidance was intended to fill that gap. And the challenges, as we know, working with NGOs is that ethical considerations, whether formal or informal, can take a lot of resources, time, and capacity as well. So hopefully this guidance can help to fill some of those challenges. The audience for the guidance is meal practitioners, as well as people working as program and project managers, and also funding agencies. So what does the guidance cover? There's some definitions in terms of the what. In terms of the when, there's some discussion on when you might consider going through formal ethics to a research ethics board, which is not usually required for evaluations if you're not intending to generalize knowledge. But many NGOs, you want to publish your work, you want to ensure your findings are heard more broadly, and that requires ethics. Also, as we'll hear later, there's some countries require ethics, formal ethical approval, even if you're doing evaluation and not research. Also, I think important to note that having formal ethics approval shouldn't give anyone a false sense of security that you've done everything that you need to do just because you have that formal approval. So I think there's lots for us to think about. And even if you don't go through formal approval, ethical considerations are key given our commitments to feminist meal, our efforts to decolonize, ensuring participation and ownership by partner countries and communities. And who leads this work? That could be your meal staff, your monitoring, evaluation, accountability, learning staff, or it could be your staff leading on safeguarding and protection. So the guide goes into ethical principles and consideration. We've heard about all of these, but hopefully the intent is to give a bit of a table for some considerations for each of these principles. So for example, around respect, the importance of following a rights-based approach, ensuring participants in evaluations or studies or monitoring understand the activity, what they're being asked to do, what the risks and the benefits are, how you're going to address confidentiality, how long are you going to be keeping the data, and that they provide explicit consent. In terms of concern for welfare and safeguarding, that could be also ensuring the benefits of the data being collected outweigh the harm. Around justice, fairness, and equity, making sure participants are treated fairly, human rights-based approach is taken, that you're selecting participants in an inclusive, non-discriminatory way, that you have reporting mechanisms and contact people if any ethical issues arise. In terms of ownership of the data, who owns the data and who owns the resulting products is key, and the participants need to be able to understand that. Accountability, making sure your staff and your consultants have the competencies to be able to undertake the work, that there's transparency throughout the process, that you've identified any potential ethical issues and conflict of interest, and that you have ethical guidance and codes of conduct that are followed. And you'll see in the guidance note as well, there are some examples in the back and the appendix that you might want to use. And around community engagement, to making sure the community is engaged from start to finish, and that the processes align with the values of the community. Going to the next section of the guide, there's also a table around a sort of a checklist on ethical considerations by stage of the monitoring, evaluation, accountability, and learning, the process itself, all the way from developing the project all the way to dissemination and feedback loops. So for example, in project design, was the project co-designed with the community? How will the community be meaningfully involved? One of the first projects I worked on in my professional career was a participatory action research project where we had a community research associates team who guided our work, made up of people from the community. That takes a lot of time and a lot of resources, and those things need to be considered when you're developing the project. If you're in determining if you need formal ethical approval, what are the requirements of the country that you're working in? We're going to hear more about Tanzania's requirements, including their data transfer agreement requirements. If you don't need to go through formal ethical approval, how can you ensure you're actually following good ethical principles? Some NGOs have their own ethics review panels. Many projects seek more informal approval at the community or the local government level. For budget and timelines, have you thought about formal or informal ethics and how long those processes can take? Do you have local staff on board who can help with these various procedures? Around developing indicators and data collection, are you ensuring you're not collecting more data than you actually need to make sure that you're not having an undue burden on the community? Have you pilot tested the tools? What about literacy levels, local context, the sensitivity of the topic? In terms of training your data collectors, your enumerators and your facilitators, how have you incorporated ethics into those trainings? Do they understand the importance of ethics? Consent's a big area, and we talk about that quite a bit in the guidance, but you need to consider literacy levels, legal requirements, power dynamics, what's culturally appropriate. When you're recruiting, what happens if a person, we've had situations where people have shown up that don't fit the criteria. How are you going to deal with those things? So having processes in place considering the ethics pieces. In data collection, considering who is collecting the data, for example, having people from the same age range or the same sex, people who speak the language, obviously, to collect the data. Compensation can be culturally specific, but also you need to consider out-of-pocket costs. How are you going to ensure people aren't having out-of-pocket costs to get to where you're meeting with them, for example? Managing data, where will data be stored? For how long? What protections will you consider to make sure that that data is safe? These are oftentimes things that are not considered, especially in the field. What's going to be happening with all those paper copies of things and notes? Those are all things that need to be considered. Analysis and sense making, how are you going to engage local stakeholders in the co-analysis, validation, and use of the findings? And reporting, how are you going to protect confidentiality in reporting? What about use of quotes? Who's going to get credit for the report and the publications? And around dissemination, what feedback loops are you going to be using with the community? What different formats are you going to be able to use to reach the community? So these are all things that should be considered, and they're all talked about in this checklist within the guide. There's also a very short section on special considerations around different populations. The guide, of course, could be very, very long. We were trying to keep it short. There's lots of different populations that really require different lenses. In terms of children, as an example, you need to get assent from children and consent form from the parents usually. You need to consider when you're going to break confidentiality when it comes to children. So for example, any disclosure of abuse or child protection issues. And we also consider when we're collecting data from children, so when we're going to collect data and where, so as not to disturb school schedules, for example, or also making sure they're not out after dark. For 2SL LGBTQI plus populations, there's lots of considerations. We don't get into the detail in the guide, but we've had situations, for example, from my work where we were going to do some work this was a few years ago in Uganda, men who have sex with men, and we decided against it. It wasn't worth collecting the data. The risks of collecting the data greatly outweighed the potential benefits. And so these are things you need to consider, especially with some of these vulnerable groups. I'm going to just ask, I think CanWatch will put, or if they haven't already, put some resources in the chat for more Indigenous resources as well. That's also a very important group, but one that would require many other guidance and people who are much more in the know than myself. So, but there are, I think, a lot of resources out there that can be helpful when working with Indigenous groups as well. And a lot of care has to be taken working with gender-based violence as well in terms of collecting data. So these are all areas that I think would require a lot more information, but there is a bit of discussion about that and additional resources in the guide. At the back of the guide, there are additional resources, including UN resources on ethics, example of other countries and their guidelines, professional associations, including the Canadian Evaluation Society, examples of ethical guidance from different non-governmental organizations, a number of templates and samples and tools, including consent forms, pledges for staff and consultants, for example, that you may want to use, additional resources on gender-based violence, and on feminist meal, and also a training in ethics, including one from UNICEF, which I took before I included just to see if it would be helpful. I found it very helpful, especially for people who may be new to this area. So that may be another resource that would be helpful for people too. So that's the brief presentation on the guide itself. I hope you'll be able to take a closer look. We have it, the links there en anglais et en français, and it's as with other CanWatch documents, a living document. So hopefully if you have other comments or questions on that, you can contact CanWatch and provide any additional resources and such as we go along as well. So I'm just going to stop the sharing here so we can see everyone here. So our next session, and again, if you have questions as we go along, we'll be taking questions at the end as well. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat. But I'm just going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to get into some questions with our panel as well. I'm going to take a bit of a sip of water. As people who are in this area know, it's very smoky here and it's not helping my already gravelly voice. So my illustrious panel, I'm very happy to have them agree to be on a panel today to talk about ethics, people who have done a lot of work in this area. So first we have Dr. Mike Lang, who's a digital storytelling specialist. He received his PhD from University of Calgary in 2022. And since 2017, he's been working with Mombara University of Science and Technology and Healthy Child Uganda on digital storytelling to enhance child and maternal health. So welcome, Mike. We also have Dr. Banush Aranjani, who is health monitoring and evaluation specialist at HealthBridge. And she's a PhD in public health and nutritional epidemiology and more than 20 years of experience in health research and development in the Middle East, the UK, Canada, and Southeast Asia. Welcome, Banush. Madame Sophie Bourdon, elle est la directrice de l'innovation et de l'expertise chez Santé Monde, issue des secteurs de la communication sociale et du droit international. Elle est passionnée par les nouvelles opportunités d'apprentissage qui offrent l'intégration transversale d'approches multisectorielles et multidisciplinaires. And then, even though I have my translation off, it's still going in my ear, so it's hard for me to speak. I don't know why it's doing that, but anyway, so sorry. Dr. Oresto Manushi, who has 15 years of experience in designing and undertaking program monitoring and evaluation in HIV projects, maternal and child health, nutrition and health system strengthening. He serves as the Strategic Information Director for ICAP Mailman School of Public Health, Columbia University in Tanzania. And he has an MD and an MPH and is a PhD candidate in Finland. I personally work with Dr. Manushi on a number of projects and evaluations in Tanzania. So welcome, Oresto. And if Oresto has to go off camera, we understand. He's there very late at night after 9 p.m. and also internet can be challenging. So thank you again to my panel. I'm going to start off with questions for each of our panelists, and then we'll move on from there. I'm going to start with Banush. And talk a bit about HealthBridge and the work HealthBridge does. So Banush, how does HealthBridge decide whether to go through formal ethics or to use more informal ethics processes?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the introduction and the question. So first of all, I want to mention that HealthBridge has research in its mandate. And I know that many of the organizations don't have that mandate. So we have it. So if there is a need and opportunity to go through formal ethics approval, then we will do that, and then we just look at the projects and what we do from a research lens as well. So that's one thing. The second point is looking at our other capacity. At this point, we, when we have the capacity of going through the formal research approval, for sure, we would do that for our current projects in Bangladesh, Nepal, and Vietnam. We've had that capacity, so we applied. And then I think the third point, which is more to do with having another lens when it comes to go for the ethics approval process, is that we are working with our partners in different communities, and they have a very good understanding of their communities and what is working, what is culturally appropriate, what are the challenges. But going through the ethics approval actually add that ethics lens and more like academic lens to what we do. So through the process that we followed, we learned actually from the reviewers, and we were very appreciative of that, because their comments, like the ethics approval comments, actually helped us to refine our tools and processes, and that was very helpful. And then the other things, of course, is the requirements from the funding agencies, and do we have time to be able to go through the formal ethics. That takes time, as most of the people know. It's not an easy process, and then if we basically don't have enough time, we wouldn't go through formal.
Thanks very much, Banush. And I should have been speaking slower, but I'll remind our panelists to speak slow. That was me speaking slow, sadly. But I'll just remind our panelists that our poor translators have to keep up. So I apologize to our translators. Banush, I wanted to ask a follow-up question. In the guide, we use as one of the examples HealthBridge's work in the SRHR projects, where you trained young women to conduct surveys and focus groups with women and adolescent girls, and you trained young men to conduct focus groups with men and adolescent boys. What did that training include in terms of ethics, and what challenges did you face in terms of that work?
Sure. So basically, we provided training into different projects and settings. So in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, we had the local consultants who took care of the training. So we had, and then they did that wasn't online, because everything nowadays is online. So they did it in person in Bengali by the researchers and professionals in the field. So for them, that wasn't a big challenge, because they just did it in a real setting, and then they had the opportunity to send the team of researchers to the field to do pilot testing, and then based on that pilot testing, they gave us feedback. So we just updated a few of the things on our tools, and that was convenient. They had their own issues, because we are working basically with the slum population in Bangladesh. So there were issues with sampling and all of that, and that all got resolved through that pilot process. So that wasn't to do with training, but that was part of the training. that we figured out that what are the challenges. But with Nepal, we did the whole training online. This was, of course, in the middle of the pandemic. But then we couldn't actually go to do the area to do the training. But we have Nised, one of our colleagues, and I think that he's on the call. So Nised is from Nepal, so he speaks Nepali, and then that was actually the main reason that we were able to do the training online. There were many lessons learned during that process. So basically, the challenges in doing the training online were more technical challenges, I would say, because of the poor connection. We are working with a group of researchers and implementation team who are based in mountainous areas with very unstable internet. And then we had like the time difference. So for 3 nights in a row, Nised and I did the online training, and it was very, very late in Ottawa. I'm based in Calgary, so for me, it wasn't that late. I think that we finished 1 in the morning, but it was very, very late for Nised. So that was one of the challenges that we faced. But I would say that doing the training in the local language was the strength of this whole training. That there was no misunderstanding or you know, anything that would make the participants not to be able to grasp like everything that was delivered. And in terms of having, like, you know, female data collection team for the female and male, that was, we didn't have like any challenge with that, but one of the lessons learned was that like even the adolescents boys in the focus group, they were very comfortable with female coordinators to facilitate the FGD session. So these are the points that we'll learn from doing the pilot, because we did a pilot, like very, very small pilot testing as part of the training. So that was really helpful, because that there was the training, and then the data collection team actually went to the field, did the data collection for 1 day, facilitated 1 focus group discussion. They came back to us, gave their feedback, and we adjusted the data collection process based on that.
Super. Thank you so much, Benouche. That's very interesting. I think lots of learnings there. I'm next going to turn to Sophie. Sophie, pour discuter l'éthique informelle, quelle alternative de l'éthique formelle est-ce que Santé Monde utilise pour votre travail en SERA? Et pourquoi avez-vous décidé d'utiliser des processus plus informels?
Oui, merci Elisabeth, puis merci pour l'invitation. C'est un plaisir aussi de collaborer à ce panel-là avec les invités qui sont représentés aujourd'hui. Pourquoi on a décidé d'opter pour l'informel? Peut-être d'abord, je commencerai par... Je me suis beaucoup questionnée, en fait, sur ce qu'on voulait dire par informel, parce que souvent, je considère que le terme informel est négativement connoté, hein, comme si faire de l'éthique informelle, c'est ne pas en faire vraiment. Ou c'est ne pas suivre les règles, alors que de notre point de vue, passer par une certaine informalité, c'est un outil de renforcement, notamment du lien de confiance. On pourra certainement y revenir là, tout à l'heure. Mais on s'est tourné, entre autres, pas seulement, mais entre autres vers des pratiques informelles, parce qu'on travaille dans des conditions où on a à adresser des enjeux très délicats. On pense par exemple à la santé sexuelle et reproductive, qui sont des enjeux dans le cadre desquels c'est important d'avoir différentes avenues possibles d'éthique applicable. Donc, les cadres demeure important. C'est important d'avoir des outils officiels, des validations éthiques officielles, ça prend de la documentation, des preuves écrites, tout ça est important. Mais pour la qualité de l'information et l'approfondissement de la qualité des données probantes qu'on va recueillir, on a besoin aussi de s'appuyer sur certains processus qui sont davantage ancrés dans les communautés. On travaille à Santé Monde, on a le privilège de collaborer avec des communautés un peu partout à travers le monde qui ont des pratiques orales importantes. Donc, dans ce cadre-là, une transmission d'informations qui se ferait de manière très formelle peut être dommageable pour la qualité du lien de confiance que l'on établit, puis la qualité des données qu'on va aller colliger. Donc, c'est un peu dans cette dynamique-là qu'on s'est tourné vers des alternatives. Donc, pour moi, tout l'aspect informel, peut-être, devrait porter le chapeau savoir-être, savoir-faire. Ce n'est pas exclusivement que de l'informalité, donc de la petite démarche non importante, mais c'est une démarche tout autant scientifique qui a une valeur ajoutée réelle. Ouais.
Merci beaucoup. Et je pense que c'est important de... oui, c'est vrai, l'informel, ce n'est pas comme moins bon que formel. Et comme j'ai dit avant, si vous avez l'athlétique formelle, par exemple, ça ne dit pas que c'est tout. Ça ne dit pas que, oh, j'ai fait ça, j'ai fini. Non, c'est une chose, on a besoin de continuer, de savoir est-ce qu'il y a un problème, est-ce qu'il y a les choses, est-ce que nous avons besoin de faire les autres choses. And like Benish spoke about earlier, what are we learning as we go from our processes and adjusting as we go as well, because this is part of the learning process. Donc, merci beaucoup, Sophie, pour ça. Right now, I'm going to turn to Mike to talk a bit about the storytelling piece. So first, Mike's just going to give us a sentence or two on what storytelling have to do with meal and monitoring and evaluation, but then to talk about how he addresses ethics in his storytelling work to make sure that storytelling, the storyteller well-being, and some areas of consent and ownership. Mike.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, monitoring, evaluation, storytelling, how are they connected? Well, I really think, my biostatistics professor years ago said, numbers don't mean anything until they have context. And so I think a lot of people, especially in the evaluation side of project, when you provide some stories, it helps contextualize all these numbers, right? And it adds meaning, makes them meaningful. So that's one of the reasons why using storytelling or stories, in meal is a great approach. I also think that, oh, sorry. Hey, Jack, go. Sorry. Just 1 second. Jack, what? No, I can't. Can you go talk to Mama? Thanks. Man, that happens every once in a while. Sorry about that. Also, though, I think when it comes to storytelling and meal, one of the things that it can do is it actually makes people care about the numbers as well, right? Not only does it help contextualize numbers, it helps people want to know them or want to engage with them and understand them in a sort of a deeper way. And I think that's what stories really can help us do. They can't tell us what we should do better or how we should do it differently, but they can tell us why it matters. And so if you want people to understand why, and some of you guys may be familiar with that very famous Simon Sinek TED Talk, it's always good to start with why. And that's what stories can do in the context of monitoring evaluation. Why are we presenting these numbers? Why does this project matter? Here's a story to help contextualize and make these numbers more meaningful. So yeah, that was my first answer there. Elizabeth, what was the second question?
The second question was how have you addressed ethics in your storytelling work?
Yes. Yeah. So, it's really interesting just building off what you and Sophie were just talking about. I wrote a chapter in my thesis called Beyond the White Gloves. And formal ethics, it's almost like you have these white gloves. You're like an English butler looking for dust on the lampshades in the hallways, you know, and it actually, when just outside the door in the street, there's mud everywhere, right? It's messy. There's dirt under your fingernails. And so you got to pull on work gloves. And I really see, you know, the informal sort of ethics, it's putting on those work gloves and being committed to something called storyteller well-being. And I think that storyteller well-being idea can translate in many different ways, but really it's asking yourself at every sort of step, different step in a process, asking yourself, by doing this, will I enhance storyteller well-being or detract from storyteller well-being? You know, and you can say that about anyone, right? By asking this question, will I enhance their well-being or detract from their well-being? You know, by trying to collect data in this way, will it enhance their well-being or detract from their well-being? And I like your example, you know, in Uganda, right, where you decided asking these questions would detract from the well-being of these men in this community, and therefore we chose not to. So really, this idea of storyteller well-being, you know, when I train people to do digital storytelling, this is what I really want them to focus on. By telling this story, by asking this question, by incorporating this part of this person's life into the story, will it enhance or detract from their well-being? And I found, as a blanket sort of principle, that's a really, it allows you to make more ethical decisions in the moment, right? With your work gloves on, and in the messy situations that sometimes you can find yourself in, right? The other thing I would say, the other two principles would be just being super clear up front. We are asking you to tell this story for this reason. And this is how it's going to be used. And this is why we would like to have stories. And this is how, you know, it could impact this project. You know, it's just being really clear with goals and expectations. And this is a principle from classic ethics. You know, for people to actually make informed consent decisions, they need to be informed. And so sometimes when people collect stories as a part of monitoring and evaluation, they're not super clear about why, right? To the person they're asking and they're getting the story for, they're not super clear about what the story, why they're collecting the story, why they would like to have it, things like that. So just being really clear up front about goals and objectives of having these stories. And then finally, that sort of ties into this final thought of continual consent. Stories are a little different than sort of de-identified generalized data, right? This is a direct representation of someone's life. And so it is, stories are not commodities, right? That can be bought and sold and traded. They are a direct representation of this person, and therefore they need to be treated differently. And so someone's story is theirs alone. They own it. And so when we create digital stories with people, we say, you own this story. This is your story. You are providing consent for us to also share the story to maximize its impact on the behalf of this particular project. And things like that. So the storytellers always own their story. It's theirs. And they're just allowing us to share it to maximize its impact in the world. And so in that context, you know, this continual consent process means that if you ever want to share that story outside of the original context where it was created, right? We created this digital story to be included in this evaluation report. However, we think it would be wonderful to be able to share it to this group of policymakers. You always need to go back and ask for consent again, right? Because the story is being shared outside of the original consent context that was provided. So it's so that's what I mean by continual consent. Of course, there's all these moments of assent and consent throughout the story creation process. But at the end, when you're actually sharing it with people, if it's ever shared outside of the original context, it's just going back to that person and saying, you own this story. You allow us to share it in our evaluation, but we'd also like to share it to these policymakers. Is that okay? And then they can you know, say yes or no. So yeah, those ideas: storyteller well-being, clear communicating goals and objectives, continual consent, and just being really clear about story ownership. I think those are some of the biggest principles that can help when you're trying to incorporate storytelling into your meal activities.
Thanks, Mike. That's very, very helpful, and I think very interesting. And I think also applies even beyond storytelling. You know, when you talk about enhancing or detracting from well-being, you know, I always think of it as benefits and harms, but I think your language is much more accessible, and ensuring people always know the why, the goals and the objectives, and continual consent, whether that's stories, whether that's longitudinal research, whether that's monitoring over time. and ownership, such an important piece with storytelling, but also with other methods as well, especially as we decolonize and move more, hopefully, to community participation and community ownership. So thank you so much for that. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to turn to Oresto now to ask a few questions. So as I mentioned earlier, Oresto is based in Tanzania, and we've done some work together going through formal ethics in Tanzania. So Oresto, can you tell us a bit about your experience in terms of what are the requirements for ethics for monitoring and evaluation projects in health in Tanzania? Because I think a lot of people think as long as it's evaluation, I don't have to go through formal ethics. I can just I can skip that. Can you tell us what Tanzania's requirements are?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and everyone else. Speaking from Morogoro, a little bit outside Dar es Salaam, which is a business city for Tanzania, and I hope you can hear me well. Yeah, so a little bit of a difference from what everyone else has described. In Tanzania, and I believe in many resource-limited countries, we've moved a very long journey into describing and formalizing our ethical needs. Actually, we have ethics. Ethical approval is required for anything that is human subject. You know, like any information that is based on a person, you are required to get an ethical approval to manipulate that information, to analyze it, and even to, to present it in any form of a third party. It is okay if you are running a program. For instance, if you are collecting data, information from a hospital based, and you are just registering patients and using that information for the benefit of the patients, that's fine. You do not require ethics as much as this information is already pre-registered. But even with that information, which we call it routinely collected information, if you start asking questions like, what if, or why this or why that, information that requires sort of an additional information from the subjects, even if that information has already been priorly collected as a routine information, you still require an approval, ethical approval, to go through that. And that is the first layer. That is sort of like the first understanding of where is ethics required. So even in evaluation, where you have run a project, for instance, for nutrition, and you have supplied some substances or nutrients, and you have collected information about the recipients, things like age, sex, and stuff, which is a program. Then if you require to evaluate that program, if you start asking, as I said, if you start asking like, how much have my supplements improved the health for the beneficiaries, then that becomes sort of what we say an assessment, or a sort of non-determined research, and then that requires an ethical approval. So, and once that is done, the process goes a little bit further. For Tanzania, we have actually established a mechanism where there are two boards that approve research ethics, and not necessarily research ethics, any type of ethics. So we have NIMRI, which is a National Institute for Health Research, which is required to, you submit your protocols and all the information about the evaluation you are doing, and then they read that through, they subject it to a committee, and then upon review of the process and check that you are not violating any ethical requirements, then they can guarantee you an approval. However, we also have what we call COSTECH. It's a science committee, sort of. It's a body which sits in between NIMRI and whoever is doing research or an evaluation. And that board requires to understand the science of the evaluation we are doing. So doing ethics is one thing, but then it also has to contain the scientific component of it. And so there are all this onto the process. In Tanzania, again, it is required if the PI for a particular evaluation or research or an assessment is from outside the country, it is required that you get a call in the country. And this was for really a good reason. You know, this is a resource limited country, and we have a multitude of young people and the old people that are also aspiring to become, you know, like investigators, and they need, and funding for research, internal funding for research and evaluation is not that big. So whenever we have resources coming from outside, we want the skills to be nurtured for our young people to also be able to be embedded in, you know, in such projects, so they also become familiar and able to do research on their own if necessary. But again, as I said, if you then happen to be coming from outside the country and you are able to, you get the approval to do an evaluation or research in the country, and you collaborate with the local investigator, then if it happens that you have got to take that information outside the country, any information has to be, first of all, de-identified. This is a basic requirement. Even if you are doing it in country, you still need to de-identify the information so that the subjects are not exposed. But if it's going outside the country, if the analysis is going to be done outside the country, or if you are going to discuss any sort of information about the data outside the country, it is actually required that you get what we call data transfer agreement. And this goes, it's sort of like really a second approval, which after you've collected the data, you need to go back to the NIMRI to ask for data transfer agreement. And this is a legal agreement that the data that goes outside will be used as per the agreement that was forged before. So if, for instance, you transfer this information outside and decide to analyze it in a different way other than what you had described during the data transfer agreement, that is sort of really not allowed by law. So you will have to come back to the country and, you know, forge another agreement that we looked at this data in this modality, and we feel like we can look at it in a different modality and find out more, you know, like any other findings that you may have to find out, you will have to come back to the country to do the process again. There is also what we call material transfer agreement. So if, for instance, in your evaluation or research, you collected materials, any sort of materials, whether being soil, plant material, or human material, you also have to get what we call material transfer agreement, and you can ship that material outside the country for laboratory testing, for instance, or whatever analysis you want to do outside the country, which maybe resources are limited in the country. However, if you decide at some point later on, after you stored the material, and you decide that you want to do another analysis, which is not prescribed in the previous material transfer agreement, you will still have to come back to the country and agree again on how to use that material. And if it's agreeable between both parties, then you are allowed to continue. And these mechanisms, which seem to be very strict and it takes time to get, were put in place really to safeguard the, you know, like the interests of the people of the country, but the subjects, you know, like these are people who are mostly in the remote area. They know little about what goes on with the material they provided and the information they provided. So the country is really trying to protect them, that the material they gave permission to prior is not used against what they had initially or primarily agreed to. So in brief, that's how it goes
Thank you.
here in Tanzania, and we have enjoyed it, even though it's cumbersome, but yeah.
Thank you so much, Ernesto. And I think I thought this was such an excellent example, because I think when we're talking about decolonization and ensuring safeguarding of participants, I think Tanzania, I mean, Ernesto and I really pulled our hair out going through some of these processes, but you know, it really shows the safeguarding of the participants and trying to avoid the helicoptering of researchers, usually white researchers from away, coming into a country, dropping in, taking that data out, and then also has requirements around data ownership and co-production, et cetera, in terms of the reporting and the journal articles as well. So again, I think the key message I'm hoping from this panel is really around. It doesn't have to be formal. Sometimes it has to be formal, but really it's asking the right questions for the protection of people and the safeguarding of our respondents, and how do we do that in a systematic way, whether that's through formal forms or whether that's through our own processes internally. So I now want to open up to questions from the floor. I see we have one question already, but please keep the questions coming. The first question here is from Diana. I've heard of a similar law in South Africa. Do you think data transfer agreements will become more common across other countries in Africa and other contexts? Arresto, can you comment on that? Do you think these data transfer agreements will become more common in other countries? I know I've been through ethics in about a dozen countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and Tanzania certainly is the strictest. But have you seen, Arresto, any other data transfer agreements in other areas, including South Africa?
So in East Africa, we have common understanding around research. So East Africa comprises Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, Burundi, and now South Sudan. I think our processes are a little bit similar. There may be some differences between here and there, but we sort of really basing the same understanding of what is required for research ethics. They may have different bodies, but I know for sure they all have national ethical review board. As for the other countries in Africa, I'm not sure.
But do they have data transfer agreements? I know I've been through ethics recently in Uganda and Burundi and Kenya, and they didn't have data transfer agreements. So I don't know if you have heard of others having data transfer agreements.
No, not very sure about that.
Se. But I won't be surprised. I mean, Tanzania oftentimes is a leader in terms of protection of, I find, of their country people. But I won't be surprised if others follow suit, given again the push to try not to have people come in, just collect data and leave. Some of the harms I think that have been caused over the years. I don't see any other questions in the meeting chat. Please, or you can raise your hand if you have a question as well. I've got questions that I will ask in the meantime while we wait for others. One question I know comes up a lot. I'm going to ask the whole panel this. When I was writing this guidance note, and some of the metrics working group members are on Benush was there, Bart I see as well, and we're helping with the guidance note. What comes up oftentimes is challenges of timing, capacity, and resources in addressing ethical considerations. So do you have suggestions about timing, capacity, and resources in addressing ethical considerations? Avez-vous des suggestions pour la durée, le timing, la capacité et les ressources pour les considérations éthiques en SERA?
I think I can speak to the formal ethics, getting formal ethics approval. So one thing is, in most of the countries, there are different bodies that you can apply to for getting ethics approval. Just doing a quick search to just find out what would be the most appropriate ethics body to apply for. The other thing that I've learned is that once you have your first draft of ethics, it's better to submit sooner than later, because then you can just, submit your amendments if your tools are not ready at the time of the application. So if you have like minimum requirements, please go ahead and apply, because getting approval is a very lengthy process, and it's better to start that communication. The other, and this is my experience of working with the National Ethics Board of Nepal, is that if you just start communicating, with the secretary of the board, or whoever is, you have their contacts, it's better to contact them and then, you know, just show your willingness and that you have like these deadlines. And sometimes it works in terms of speeding up the process and, you know, getting the reviewers' comments, you know, one by one, if not all of them already provide their feedback, but if you can just have the feedback one by one, that could speed up the process. And of course, that's very cliche, but working with the local partners hand in hand from the very beginning.
Thanks, Banush. Sophie.
Oui, merci. Puis peut-être pour ajouter à ce qui vient d'être nommé sur les aspects plus informels, moi, j'aime beaucoup attirer notre attention sur la notion de ressources. On a toujours l'impression que ça nous prend des ressources dédiées qui sont des professionnels de la recherche et de l'éthique et de la collecte de données. Mais quand on réfléchit à des aspects de collecte informelle ou d'éthique informelle, tout le monde est responsable de l'éthique dans un projet. On a tous la responsabilité d'assurer moralement et éthiquement l'atteinte adéquate des résultats d'un projet. À cet effet-là, toutes les ressources qui sont impliquées dans un projet sont importantes. Puis, je donne un exemple précis de ça. On a dans nos équipes locales des responsables du suivi, évaluation, apprentissage. Mais on a aussi, pour l'ensemble de nos équipes locales et même dans certains cas, une collaboration avec, par exemple, nos chauffeurs, les responsables de l'entretien de nos lieux de travail. On a des travaux avec eux sur la santé sexuelle et reproductive, ce que ça représente, ce que ça veut dire, les enjeux que ça peut représenter que de travailler avec des populations aussi vulnérables. Donc, ce sont des discussions qui sont tenues avec l'ensemble de nos équipes, pas exclusivement avec des personnes qui sont responsables de la collecte de données, parce que tout le monde peut avoir un rôle à jouer en matière d'éthique. Et notamment, on a des grilles d'observation non participantes, des grilles qui nous permettent d'aller collecter de l'information sur ce qu'on observe. Quand je dois offrir un atelier ou quand je dois accompagner un partenaire qui offre un atelier, je vais voir des choses. Peu importe mon rôle dans l'équipe de mise en œuvre d'un projet, je vais être à même d'observer parfois des réticences, des comportements particuliers, des gens qui sont davantage exclus. Je vais observer peut-être que certaines personnes en situation de pouvoir semblent influencer la tournure des conversations. Bon, mais tous ces éléments-là d'observation non participante, ils sont à considérer dans l'analyse et la qualité de l'intervention d'un projet. Donc, même s'il ne s'agit pas de faire de la collecte de données stricto sensus, au sens où on l'entend dans de la recherche appliquée, il reste que ce sont des informations utiles qui doivent être réfléchies, analysées, puis qui ont la vocation d'orienter, voire réorienter, si on en tient compte adéquatement, des interventions dans un projet. Donc, pour moi, ces éléments-là, ces exemples-là, bien qu'ils soient informels, ils ont formellement un impact sur les projets. Donc, les ressources, il faut les réfléchir au-delà des ressources humaines dédiées au suivi, évaluation, apprentissage.
Merci. Et peut-être nous avons besoin de chercher un autre mot que informel, parce que ce n'est pas informel. And it's really, as Sophie is so well saying, has to be throughout, right? We can't just think about ethics once and be done, whether that's through a formal process or not. And everybody's involved. It could be the driver. It could be all sorts of people who are involved with the ethics, with ethics throughout the project. So we have to always be thinking about ethics. So going back to some of the questions in the chat, we have just a minute or two left. So one of the questions was how long it took previous evaluations to go through formal or internal ethics approval. And Banusha said between 6 to 12 months. I would agree there, but maybe we can have the panelists comment on that. It can be as short as 3 months. It can be longer than 12. But probably 6 to 12 sounds good, but let's see what others may have to say. And the other question as we wrap up, when you ask for consent and explain the data will be shared with a larger audience, sometimes participants get scared or hesitant and avoid being interviewed. How do you handle those situations? So, and Banush was saying training on the data collection team is key. I don't know, Mike or Resto, if you have anything to add for us in the last minute on either of those questions before we wrap up.
Yeah, I would say, from a storytelling perspective, there's lots of different things you can do, right? You can de-identify stories as much as possible by taking out dates, times, and places, right? To decrease sort of their tentativeness around sharing that story. But ultimately, it all depends on how and where and why the story is going to be shared. And as long as they're really clear about it, I often say for digital stories, which are very hard, they're short films. I forgot to mention what they are. They're sort of short films that are created by the person themselves with the support of a facilitator. It's very difficult to de-identify those stories the same way you can with other types of data. And so we have a very clear intake process and a 4-page sort of intake algorithm to make sure we're making ethical decisions at every step of that process. And one of those things is if people are scared or hesitant to tell the story, maybe a digital story isn't the best way to do it, right? Maybe they can do a written story that's de-identified, taking out dates, times, and places, and is told in a very generic way. And so as long as they, ultimately the Uganda team says it's all about trust. Healthy Child Uganda is a trusted organization in their communities, and so people trust them with their stories, and so that ultimately is what I would say is the foundation to storytelling and monitoring evaluation. If they trust you, they will share the story and trust that you will share it in a way that doesn't harm them or their well-being. So yeah.
Thanks so much, Mike. And Aresto, can you give a time? How long would you say it takes to go through ethics and the data transfer agreement, just to give an estimate of time?
So the estimated time should not be more than a month to go through the approval process, but the reality on the ground has been different. Sometimes it may take up to 2 months. It is in the past, it's actually been a whole 6 months to just get the approval, because the reviewers are very few, and the reviewers are not supposed to be paid, so they do that after their other work. So it's really a volunteer work. However, in the current time, they have really tried to put that in a more timeline manner. I think it ranges between 3 to 4 weeks, which is about a month. They have a closure where if you are looking for expedited review, you can get that for 2 weeks, but you have got to pay a little bit more, which I think it used to be around 1,000 USD. And for regular review, it is way less than that. For locals, it's actually about 300,000, which is about 150 USD, which is really small. So yes, we are stabilizing, but I agree it is taken, in the past it used to be very, very long.
Thanks so much, Aresto. So I think the key learning here is whether it's formal or informal, we do need to be putting resources and capacity and time into this. And I think we'll see that more with funders like Global Affairs Canada moving forward too, that this will become more and more important to have a more systematic way, whether that is through a formal ethics process or showing that you've thought about all of these things systematically. I really want to thank our panelists today. I'm sorry for going a couple minutes over, but this has been a very interesting discussion. I know we could talk about it for a lot longer. So hopefully this gave you a bit of a sense of this area and some of the things that people have found have worked, some of the challenges that remain. And I want to again thank Benush, Mike, Sophie, and Aresto. Merci beaucoup à tout le monde, and thank you everyone for being here. And we look forward to your further comments on the guide as hopefully people will be able to use that in their work. So thanks again. I don't know if I'm turning this back over to CanWatch or not, but.
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Merci beaucoup. Au revoir.